So if you have ever received a removal order from Canada, this is probably a video that you would find useful. I'm Nilatri Mukherjee. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. I practice in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. So a lot of times I hear that clients tell me that, well, I have received a removal order from the CBSA counter here in Canada at any of the Canadian airports. I followed the order and I left Canada. But when I tried to inquire as to what kind of removal order was it, they aren't really sure as to whether that was a departure order, that was a exclusion order, or that was a deportation order. Though as a rule, as a process, the CBSA officer should ideally inform you what kind of removal order they are giving it to you, but sometimes they do not, and hence this creates a lot of confusion. So if you're into that kind of a situation, and if you would want to come back to Canada while your removal order is still in force, this is probably a video that you will find useful. So essentially, as a concept, there are three kinds of removal order. One, the least significant of all, is called departure order. An example, you come to Canada as an international student. You could not establish that you were an international student. Either you are not carrying all the documents, or you did not answer all the questions correctly, or whatever the reason is, you are asked to leave Canada. You are not allowed to enter Canada. You may be asked to leave in the next flight or so. So that is simply called a departure order of Canada. So if you have received a departure order, you can come back to Canada literally the next day if you would like. There are no restrictions. There is absolutely no restrictions of you coming back to Canada, and you do not have to take any legal steps if you are to come back to Canada with the departure order. So this is the least significant of all. The next comes something called exclusion order. An exclusion order is something, going back to my previous example, you came here as an international student, you were not established your student identity, maybe you were lacking documents, maybe you answered some questions extremely incorrectly, which led to a round of confusions at the CBSS end, and they do believe that you could be potentially harmful to Canada, or if they allow you to enter Canada in any which ways, you will not leave Canada. In other words, you could be a flight risk. In that situation, they could give you something called an exclusion order, by virtue of which you will have to leave Canada immediately and you will not be able to come back technically within the next 12 months from the date of the exclusion order. But you could still come back, and I'll talk to that in the later part of the video. The most significant of the removal order is the third category, which is called the deportation order. Back to the same example, you were a student, come to Canada, could not establish your identity, or maybe alongside that you were also carrying some fraudulent documents, and immigration has given you, now the CBSA is giving you the deportation order, by virtue of which you have to leave Canada immediately, and that you cannot come back to Canada again technically for a period of 5 years. Okay, so this is the harshest of all. So departure order, you can come back to Canada next day. Exclusion order, you can come back to Canada after 12 months. Deportation order, you can come back to Canada after 5 years. But say, for example, you have received an exclusion order, or you have received a deportation order, but you still have an urgent situation because of which you would like to come back to Canada, either within a period of 1 year or within a period of 5 years. In other words, you want to come back to Canada while any of those enforcement orders were in force. Do you really have an option? Sometimes, yes, you can apply for something called authorization to return to Canada and can come to Canada as a temporary resident, right? You may also be potentially eligible to apply for something called a temporary resident permit, and can again come to Canada as a temporary resident. Now, these are the complicated legal applications, and this is not for everybody. For example, you cannot say that, well, I want to meet my cousin and hence I would like to come to Canada. That is not a reason for you to get either an authorization to return to Canada or a temporary resident permit. But let's say, for example, if you are a wife whose husband is there in Canada, and the husband is either a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, and you have been banned due to whatever reason, that really calls for to apply for something like an authorization to return to Canada. This is a serious situation, and if you have a dependent child, if you have dependent children, those adds up to the story, right? So I'm talking about real situations, real serious circumstances that call for you to apply for authorization to return to Canada. or a temporary resident permit, but this is not for all. Both of these applications are completely discretionary on IRCC, meaning that you can very well send a perfect application, but whether those applications will be accepted or not are on the discretion of the IRCC, right? So, but obviously this does not mean that you will not send a concrete, a foolproof application. You surely will, but it is discretionary. And because it is discretionary, there is no such definite processing times attached to either of those applications. I work on these kind of cases a lot. So from my experience, I could tell you is that sometimes I see a decision comes in 15 days. Sometimes I also see the clients literally wait for months to get a decision. And sometimes even after trying so hard, we do not even get a decision. Very, very rare, but still a possibility. So before venturing into any of these things, you have to understand whether you actually qualify or not. If you do not qualify, there is absolutely no point in spending time, money, and energy into this process, because this is not for everybody. But if you do qualify, and if the situation really demands, IRCC looks and views these situations from agency perspective, from humanitarian and compassionate perspective, and they do from time to time issue temporary resident permits and authorization to return to Canada, permits. So if you need my assistance with any of these situations, if you're already banned, if you want to come to Canada, and if you want me to explore your options, book a relevant consultation through the website nuvonation.ca. That is the first step. I'll be very happy to have a case-specific detailed discussion with you to take it forward from there. I hope this helps you guys in the next one. Bye now.